And if anyone has any concerns during this workshop, please feel free to use the chat box and you can privately message me. I'll be monitoring the chat during our presentation to make sure we don't miss any comments or questions that come up. And we want to hear from you all as much as you're comfortable with. And I also want to remind everyone that our diversity prom for GLIS is going to be on Friday, June 4th. And I'm also going to put a link for the registration form for that in the chat box below. Now I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter for this presentation, Galina. We're both going to be presenting. Our presentation is called Beyond Lipstick, Lesbian Visibility and Registration. Or not registration, I was looking at the screen, representation. Galina, you are muted.
Okay, now we're here. Hi, everybody. So I'm Galina Swords. I am the Drop-In Center Advisor here at GLIS, which basically means that I run our Youth Drop-In Center. If you've never come to check it out, it is a space for youth ages 12 to 21, a little bit younger sometimes, and we do lots of fun activities. We have presenters and that kind of thing. So that's what I do. And then my pronouns are she, they. And I'm so happy to be doing this presentation with my co-presenter, Miss Allie Ambrosio, who is our fabulous MSW intern from the UB School of Social Work.
Thank you, Galina.
Can everybody see my little screen okay? You can just put your little thumbs up on the reply or drop a yes down in the chat box. Cool beans. Okay, so I am going to kick us off with a meme because there is no better way to start any sort of gay presentation with but a meme from the fabulous Haley Kiyoko. So it speaks for itself. And then Allie has a little bit to do about our introduction here.
All right, everyone. Hello. As Galina said, my name is Allie Ambrosio. I'm GLIS's intern and my pronouns are they, them. I am clicking the wrong thing. I'm so sorry. Hang on. Okay. So to kick off our presentation, we want to start with having a bit of a discussion with you all, breaking down lesbian identity. So we are going to be talking in this presentation about lesbian visibility and representation throughout history and today. And before we get into some information on history and representation, we are just going to take a few minutes now to break down exactly what it means to identify as a lesbian. So as you can see on the slide, the definition of the word lesbian usually refers to a woman who has romantic and/or sexual orientation towards other women. The term lesbian is typically seen as being aligned with women only. However, we want to make a point of saying that this is a common misconception of the term lesbian and the lesbian community. While the inclusivity of the term itself and the lesbian community has been a point of contention and debate for quite some time, we know that the lesbian community has always intended to include lesbians who identify outside of the gender binary, so including more than just those who identify as women. Most formal definitions of lesbian are seen only referencing women, but it's important to recognize that non-binary and gender non-conforming lesbians have always maintained a strong presence within the lesbian community. In formal definitions, like the one above that reads, lesbian usually refers to a woman who has romantic or sexual orientation towards other women. Some non-binary people also identify with this term. As you can see, the inclusivity of the term is being a bit more widely recognized and reflecting more often that not all lesbians identify as women or within the gender binary. Also, when discussing lesbian identity, there are some other terms that are often coming up within the community. I've included on the slide just some other commonly used terms, such as, sapphic or woman-loving woman, or commonly seen as just WLW. Terms like sapphic and WLW have gained a bit of popularity lately because they're often viewed as more inclusive and encompassing of queer, bisexual, pansexual, or other identities and labels for those that don't feel the term lesbian is the best descriptor for them. And just for the purposes of our presentation here today, we are going to be using the term lesbian more so like an umbrella term when referring to the content we're presenting. That's not to say that all of the individuals that we reference self-identify as lesbian. If we know how they identify, we've included it there. But we would just like to make that disclaimer for simplicity. And we would also just like to acknowledge that our discussions today are being had mainly in reference to the lesbian community within the United States, just because for Galina and I, that's our primary frame of reference and speaking from our own experiences and what we witness. And then Galina, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. All right. So in further breaking down lesbian identity and what it means to identify as a lesbian, I want to discuss with you all the more the presence of non-binary and gender non-conforming lesbians within the community. On the slide, we have a quote from the writer Jules Ryan from this amazing article called "Non-Binary Lesbians Have Always Existed." This article dives a bit deeper into the relationship between lesbian identity and gender identity. I want to ask, would any of our youth here with us today want to volunteer to read this quote out loud to all of us before we discuss it a bit more? No pressure.
It's perfectly okay if you don't. I don't mind reading it at all.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So it says, lesbianism is inherently subversive of traditional cis-het womanhood. Some lesbians feel that subversion so much that it feels like disconnect. So they feel agender or express that subversion through masculinity, or they identify as non-binary and use pronouns besides or other than she, her. If you aren't a lesbian, it's hard to understand how complex lesbians' relationship to gender is. And being free from society's strict binary constructs, which are rooted in that cis heteronormativity, that's a hard word, y'all, is one of the most beautiful and empowering things about lesbian culture. It is safety and it is home. So we know that's like a lot of information, big quote, all in one thing. But we're going to break it down for you a little bit. So Allie, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you for reading that, Galina. So I really wanted to share this excerpt from that article with all of you, just because I think that Jules did a really great job explaining how the term lesbian has always intended to include those that don't align with the traditional cis straight experience of womanhood and who don't align with the gender binary at all. So just to share, reading this helped me a lot personally better understand and describe my own identity and labels. Personally, I identify as an agender lesbian, and I've often felt like I, in the past, didn't have a right to claim that label of lesbian just because I don't identify as a woman or within the gender binary. But reading this has helped me a lot actually realize that I fell into this big misconception about the term lesbian and the lesbian community, where the misconception is that lesbian's not inherently inclusive of non-binary people and trans women and anyone outside of that, box of being a woman as we are familiar with within the gender binary. However, reading this article and this quote in particular has really helped me realize that it is and has always been possible to exist as a lesbian and within that community without falling within the gender binary. I'd also like to invite Galina to share a bit more of their insight on this and their own experiences if you would like to.
Yeah, so like I said, I use she, they pronouns. So I identify as gender non-conforming. Gender fluid is probably the closest. Demigender. There's lots of fun identities that I enjoy, that I feel like partially encompass who I am. And that's how I feel about the identity of lesbian. I definitely feel connected to lesbian identity, lesbian culture, things of that nature. But I also understand that there are lots of histories and things with the term lesbian that have been used, unfortunately, to exclude individuals. And the way that Allie and I are talking about the term lesbian, and the way we relate to it, is a community of femme people or mass people or NB people who all approach love and caring and being in connection with each other from the same viewpoint. And so that's how we're really looking at the term lesbian. And that's why we both connect to it on a personal level. And I find a lot of community with people who also identify as lesbian and who also identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming lesbian specifically.
Thank you so much for sharing a bit about yourself, Galina, and how you identify. I also wanted to add another reason that I really like this quote too is because to me it really emphasizes the point that the word lesbian itself and any other label that you assign to yourself is meant to feel freeing and empowering, and kind of like the quote says, provide you with this sense of comfort and safety and community. And at GLIS, you know, if any of you have been to any of our programs before or talked to any of us before, you know that we always like to stress the point that choosing labels and how you identify yourself is a completely personal and unique experience for everybody. Different labels mean different things to the various people that claim them, and how you define that and yourself is completely your choice. When it comes to your own identity, no one else can dictate to you your own experiences of your gender and your sexual orientation and how those intersect. Whatever label you choose for yourself, you choose it for you. And you do that for yourself. And no one else has a right to take that away from you or invalidate it. And, you know, within the lesbian community, I know there is a lot of those misconceptions and experiences where it often appears to be a community that's not inclusive, and there are individuals within it that express that, but the community is meant to be inclusive of everybody who wants to claim the label. You know, it's open to anybody. It doesn't matter if you want to claim it, but you think you can't because you're trans or non-binary, or you've previously dated men or never dated a woman. You know, when you're choosing that label, you know, those things can exist in line with the term lesbian and within the community, because choosing that label is up to you and only you get to decide that for yourself, you know, and that goes for any label or identity that you choose. I'm going to stop ranting a little bit and turn it back over to Galina.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So this was an amazing like little backstory piece that I actually found on the current, what we would say is the most up-to-date rather version of the lesbian flag that was created by Emily Gwent in 2018. And she actually assigned these sort of terms, just like the original pride flag, where each stripe stands for a word or a term that she wanted to include as being part of the lesbian community. And this was a Twitter post that she did explaining she really wanted to include trans lesbians. She wanted to include gender nonconforming lesbians. She wanted people to understand that these flags and these labels are for pride, they're not for putting anyone down, they're not for being exclusionary, and there's so much pride and joy in community in identifying as a lesbian, in using these flags, in raising our colors. So I just really wanted to share this, and I thought it was a great little backstory piece. Oops. Okay, so then next, we wanted to talk about some fantabulous lesbians throughout history. And like we said, some of these people self-identified as a lesbian, some of them self-identified as queer women or used other labels, but they're all generally associated with queer femme history, with lesbian culture, that under that sort of umbrella term that we're using. So a little bit about lesbians and gender identity. Kind of the original butch culture got started a lot in the 1800s when women dressed up in men's clothing to go to work in factories, and a lot of them had relationships, romantic relationships with other women. And so it really started this queer culture where women were able to go out into the workforce, and they were able to have relationships and support themselves and support their partners. And so that really got this whole idea of modern lesbian roles started in the United States. So then fast forward to the 40s and 50s, post World War II, the lesbian bar culture came absolutely alive. And actually, due to drag laws at that time, people who presented as feminine or appeared to be women had to actually wear a certain amount of what the police basically deemed to be femme clothing or female clothing. And if they weren't wearing a certain number of articles, 2 or less articles of feminine clothing, they could potentially be cited or even arrested for that. So butch lesbians who wanted to express their masculinity and wanted to really present masc and express themselves had to actually pass as men in public. They often used he, him pronouns or went by men's names. They still identified as lesbian, and they may not have used those pronouns or names for themselves, but in order to express their masc gender, gender performance, they had to pass as men due to these really restrictive drag laws. So then you start to see this great shift in the 60s and 70s, obviously, with a lot of the gay rights movement and Stonewall coming up. And the person that I really wanted to highlight is the fantastic Sylvia Rivera, who you probably know as being associated with the Stonewall riots and the first Pride Parade. Sylvia oftentimes identified as a woman, identified as what would have been called at that period an effeminate gay man or a feminine gay man. Sylvia often identified as both a man and a woman, as a third gender entirely. And Sylvia fell in love with a self-identified trans woman, Julia Murray. And as you can see, this is a photo of them in the, I believe, late 60s, early 70s in one of their friends' pride shots. And I wanted to include them because you don't often see a lot of couples who are identifying as trans or genderqueer where both partners identify that way, included in lesbian representation and culture. And so we wanted to really include them because they're such a great example of a femme love couple. So then hop on forward in time just a little bit to the 90s. And the 90s was an amazing time for lesbian culture and lesbian history. If you do not, if you're not familiar with the amazing Leslie Feinberg, you should be, and read all of their books. Leslie Feinberg identified as a butch lesbian Jewish person, as an activist, as a writer, and they also wrote extensively on transgender issues and on the lesbian bar scene, which at that time had actually become quite obsolete. Leslie Feinberg really exemplified a lot of what lesbians at that time were feeling, and they were feeling left out of a lot of modern gay rights movements and a lot of the narrative in the LGBTQ community at that time. So uh, both Leslie Feinberg and, as you'll see, Ricky Ann Wilkins really exemplified moving forward in the LGBTQ community and being inclusive of not only lesbians, but lesbians of varying gender identities as well. Ricky Ann Wilkins was actually the person who came up with the term genderqueer, which I had not previously known until I was researching this presentation. And it was actually the first term that referred to non-binary folks or was considered to be a non-binary identity. Now, we're going to just move forward a little bit, and I'm going to play you a little fantastic music from Madeline Davis, who is actually originally from Buffalo's East Side. And she was the first openly lesbian delegate to be elected to a major political convention. She was also a singer-songwriter and an activist. And she founded the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Trans Archives of Western New York, which is actually housed over at Buff State. And you can see them online at buffalostatearchives.org. And so this is a little video of her song, which was considered to be like the first Pride anthem that she wrote in 1972. Okay, it's making me go directly to YouTube. Can everybody see the video?
Galina, you stop sharing your screen.
Okay. There we go.
And it was wonderful. I went to the first march I ever attended in 1971. It was a march on the state capitol in Albany. We were at the head of this line of just hundreds of people, and I'd never been in a march before, and it was scary, and it was wonderful at the same time. And I was so high from that experience that on the way home, I wrote in my notebook the words to Stonewall Nation and also a poem called From the Steps of the Capitol 1971, which is on the reverse side of the original 45 recording of Stonewall Nation. That was produced at the end of 71 by the Mattachine Society. I think we produced 545 RPM records. And people actually bought them. And I know that Craig Rodwell, owner of the Oscar Wilde bookstore, he would play it in his bookstore every June during Gay Pride. And I was delighted. I don't wanna see my brothers kicked into the dust no more. Their dreams all turned to rust no more, no more.
Come on, brothers, march along. We're all gonna sing our song right now. Right now. And sisters, take me by the hand. We're gonna build our promised land right now. Right now. And the Stonewall Nation gonna have its liberation. Wait and see, just wait and see. You can take your tolerance and shove it. We're gonna be ourselves and love it. Our nation is gonna be free. See, you can take your tolerance and shove it. We're gonna be ourselves and love it. Our nation is gonna be free.
Okay, so I just wanted to share that with y'all because I absolutely I just want to share that with y'all because I absolutely love that song, and I feel like it's really important when we are talking about the lesbian community to remember all of the people that came before us and fought for our rights and stood up. And Madeline is definitely one of those people. And I wanted to give her a shout out too, because like I mentioned, she is from the east side of Buffalo. And she went all over the country, like you saw, Albany, Miami, fighting for the rights of LGBTQ people for very, very many years. And she now lives quietly retired with her wife here in Buffalo still. So, okay, so back to our little slideshow here. I'm just going to run. Excuse me while I run forward on that. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked a little bit about a lot of the amazing figures in lesbian history, the lesbian community, a little bit of the history of identities of different lesbians in the United States, we would be very remiss if we did not mention the incredible radical queer women of color that have come in our beautiful community, because really people, when we see representation of lesbians, of queer women, even TV, movies, things of that nature, even now in 2021, we often leave out women of color, and we often leave out their contribution to the queer community. And so we think it's really, really important to include them and to lift up their voices and to recognize everything that they have done and worked on. So this is the beautiful Audrey Lord. She is absolutely my favorite author of all time. Everybody can tell you I talk about her pretty much nonstop because she's been such an inspiration to me personally. She identified as a Black lesbian. And this is just a quote by her that I absolutely love, just discussing the framework of the queer women of color, or lesbians of color, within the larger queer community, and how lesbians of color have an added layer of struggle, have an added layer of just things that come with being part of our identity as queer people. And these women of color have taken that and built their own communities and their own frameworks And it's just so inspirational to me and part of a really, really important part of our history as lesbian identified people. So here's a couple more examples. Again, just some of my personally favorite authors, performers. So the fabulous Gloria Anzaldua. So Gloria Anzaldua is originally from Texas. She's from the Rio Grande Valley. And she actually co-edited a groundbreaking book, which was called The Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color. And it was a text that is still used very much in intersectional feminist writings. It's been very influential on scholars. And she wrote another book in 1987 called Borderlands, La Frontera, which is very important in Latinx and feminist studies. She was a self-identified lesbian and Mexican American, as well as a professor and parent. So she really exemplifies a lot of history from Mexican American women who also identified as lesbians and Latinx people. Then Gladys Bentley, who was a gender bending performer, very famous during the Harlem Renaissance, which took place in the 1930s. In this photo, she's donning a top hat and tuxedo. She would go and sing the blues in Harlem establishments that eventually became extremely, extremely famous. She was known as one of the best known Black entertainers in the United States at that time. And when she passed away in 1960, the New York Times said that she was Harlem's most famous lesbian of all time. And then the last photo here is of Simone Bell, who is still living, and she became the first African-American lesbian to ever serve in a US state legislature. She's done incredible advocacy work. After her term ended, she served in the Georgia state legislature from 2009 to 2015. And after her term ended, she went to go do advocacy work at the firm Lambda Legal, which does a lot of trans and LGBTQ legal rights cases, civil rights cases. And she also worked on the Lesbian Health Initiative. So that's just an example of some lesbian identified women of color or queer women of color who've been very influential to me personally, and who really show the broad range of people who are lesbian identified or queer identified females, and how much we have accomplished and how much rich heritage and history there is, especially within queer women of color. Okay, and now I would like to take just a second, if we want to, before we begin this section, since there was a lot to unpack, and I was talking about queer women of color and lesbians and their gender identities, and I want to see if anybody just has any thoughts or questions that we want to discuss at this point. You can say them out loud, you can pop them in the chat, however you feel comfortable. I'm wondering if a few of you want to say anything about maybe who a role model is for you, if you identify as lesbian, if you don't identify as lesbian, if you identify as queer femme, anything really. Anyone who's been really inspirational to you or you find a representation. It can be a fictional character, it can be like I gave some examples, writers, politicians, actors. Okay, so while y'all are thinking about that a little more, I would love to, pop up there. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So someone in the chat was able to share that they're queer and present somewhere in between andro and femme, and you are very welcome in our family of lesbian and queer femme people. If you choose to identify that way, like you said, you identify as queer and femme. So I think it's amazing when y'all share your own personal identity stories and how you feel represented and how you identify and what those labels specifically mean to you. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. Okay. So while y'all think of maybe some more people either in history or pop culture who've been influential to you in the queer community or in the queer femme lesbian community, we're going to move on to lesbian representation in artwork. And this one, as you can see, this is a sculpture, which is actually from the Middle Kingdom, which is around the 18th century BCE, of a lesbian couple, what we would currently probably call in modern times a lesbian couple, but I'm going to explain a little bit about the backstory. So this statue is actually a Ka statue, and the ancient Egyptians believed that the soul had 9 parts. And when you went on to the afterlife, the Ka was something that made every person unique. And once the Ka was created, so the statue was created, they became a dwelling place for the spirits of both of the deceased. So when people's Kas were created and themselves and another person, be it their partner or whomever was in the Ka with them, their souls were linked for eternity. They were intertwined. So it was an otherworldly love. It was beyond what we experience while we're living on this earth. And it was, you are taking that person with you into the afterlife and you are eternally intertwined with them. So this is an example, the only example that survived of a 2 femme appearing people in a Ka representation. And this representation specifically is actually typically only a male and female appearing person who were married or who ran a household or were of nobility were pictured in or were sculpted in this manner. So the orientation sitting next to each other with their arms around each other is very indicative that these 2 figures were a couple, that they were partners and they were of equal standing. And the fact that their Ka statue is actually together means that they are together forever in the afterlife as well. So it's just a really beautiful example of ancient culture and how art has really represented lesbian and femme appearing couples throughout history for a very, very long time. Okay, and here's another example of some artwork. So the sort of top would be left on your screen. The sort of top left screen is a painting that was actually done by a male identified person of 2 obviously white appearing femme people in a loving or sexual embrace that's often been seen as a representation of lesbian artwork. But in 2013, the amazing Michelin Thomas, who is actually a Black queer artist, used mixed media photographs, I believe she used acrylics, photographs, things of that nature to make a framework of this piece in a modern fashion and to represent it with Black queer women. So I really loved the juxtaposition of these 2 artworks because it shows the journey of lesbian and queer femme representation in art. And it really shows how we value a lot more, I think, in society. We are moving towards a space where, or in the queer community, we're moving towards a space where we really value the voices of diversity as much as possible. And we really see that everyone has different bodies, everyone has different skin, and we are all beautiful and we are all part of this community together. So I just really liked that representation, and you can check out more of Egleen's art because it is amazing. Okie dokie. So off with the ancient and somewhat modern art into pop culture. So this is just some examples of modern depictions of lesbian or femme love and characters on movies and TV. 1985, the movie Desert Hearts was actually the first movie that portrayed lesbians in a positive manner. A lot of times movies previous to this portrayed lesbians in a very negative way, or it was always a very sad ending, or the couple was never able to end up together, or things like that. So this one was the first one that really portrayed lesbians in a loving and caring relationship. And it's also just a great film. And then in 1991, there was the actual first kiss between two femme people that aired on network TV in the US. So it was a big deal at that time. And it really represented moving forward in representation and visibility for femme couples in the 90s. And then 2013, we fast forward to the really groundbreaking show, Orange is the New Black on Netflix, which actually portrayed a Black trans queer woman, Sophia Bursett, played by the lovely Laverne Cox. So it really shows you a nice progression of how lesbian visibility and representation has changed and come forth throughout the last 30, 40 years. And then just to kind of cap it off, I wanted to show you this amazing little ad that I found that is, I believe, was done in the fall of last year, so very recent, that just shows you where at some point in time we would not see any LGBTQ representation in advertising and marketing at all, or possibly even very negative and stereotypical representation. We now have a lot more examples of really beautiful, positive representation.
Lift away inch, place, and down. Stay headstrong with heavy shoulders.
So it's just a really short little clip. I am actually not sure if that clip was the full thing, but as far as I could find, that was the only bit of that clip that was still online. Sorry, y'all. Slight technical difficulties, that's pretty true.
Lift away inch, place, and down. Stay headstrong
It's still
with heavy
playing.
shoulders.
Okay, there we go. So I just really wanted to show that because I love it. I know there's tons of great lesbian representative commercials and ads out there now, but I thought y'all would appreciate that since it's youth-centered and about going to a prom. And since we'll be having our virtual this year, hopefully in person next year, diversity prom on June the 4th, I thought that would get us all in the spirit. So let me just go to the last little slide here, which I just believe is questions. So Allie and I have a few questions that I think we wanted to talk about and get us kicked off, but we would love to hear from you guys. We'd love to hear from you any and every question that you have related to our presentation or something else that you're curious about. Or if you feel like sharing or feel comfortable sharing your personal experiences or stories, we'd love to hear that as well. And feel free to just drop that either in the chat box or throw them out there, however you'd like to start. Allie, I know that you were going to tell us about the first time that you saw like femme on femme love represented in pop culture.
Sure. While we have a few minutes left, I actually revisited this the other day. The first representation of queer women in general that I ever remember seeing was, I think, when I was about 11 or 12. The movie The Runaways had just come out, and it starred Kristen Stewart and Dakota Fanning, and it was about Joan Jett and the Runaways. And at the time, I think I was realizing that I was queer, but at the time when I watched it, I didn't process just how impactful that representation was. I just kind of viewed it as being so normal, and the bits that were in it, I kind of just clung to. And I revisited it actually earlier this week as an adult, and was kind of just blown away at the actual level of like explicit, you know, lesbian interactions that there were in the film, that it makes sense why I clung to it so much at such a young age. And that was kind of like my comfort movie throughout like middle school and high school, just because that was really the only representation I was aware of. And I think now we definitely have a lot more to choose from when it comes to witnessing lesbian representation in media, in TVs, and in TV and movies and things like that. We are just about done here, but if anyone has any suggestions for lesbian representation in pop culture or media, please feel free to throw it in the chat so we can all exchange that with each other. Because I know when I was younger, I would have loved to get my hands on as much as possible. So please feel free to do that. And I'm also going to put in the chat one more time for anyone that missed it, our registration form and the link to our diversity prom registration.
And remember, if you fill out that form, each time you fill out that form for every workshop that you come to, you're entered for a chance to win a little gift from Gladys, a little goodie, some Pride bars or some gift cards. So remember to fill that out for every workshop that you go to. And this is workshop number 5. I've also put up on the screen just mine and Allie's emails. Oh, only mine's incorrect. Mine should be the same as theirs. It is glyswny.org. Drop-in center at glyswny.org. So feel free to shout us out, send us an email, let us know what you thought of the workshop, what other ideas that you have. If you just want to chat, if you want to learn more about what we do or our programs, we'd love to hear from you. So thank you everybody so much for coming. And thank you for shouting out. Oh my gosh. And I just saw Booksmart the other day, for the first time, and I loved it. And I hadn't realized that there was like lesbian representation happening in it. And so it snuck up on me and I was so pleasantly surprised. So good for shouting that out.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.